Before we begin, I'll take a moment to thank Liquid Solidus 9000, pretty original username I'll admit, for recording most of the footage that will be featured in this review. There's a link to his channel in the description. I feel so bad for the guy. Some of his Spider-Man videos have gotten hundreds of thousands of views, but nowadays he's lucky to break a few hundred per vid, sometimes a few dozen, depending on the game he's LPing. Anyway, here's your shout out, Liquid Solidus. Thank you and good luck. Now on with the review. Games based on movies tend to suck. Games about superheroes tend to suck. Games based on movies about superheroes tend to suck especially. Well, not always. There are a few lucky, colorful schmucks who have somehow managed to wind up in some pretty great games. Sure, in recent years we've seen our share of superhero games like the Batman Arkham series and kinda movie tie-in games like Star Wars The Force Unleashed, but the great thing about those games is their development isn't influenced by time constraints and limited artistic liberties and all those nasty things that weigh most movie tie-in games down. Heck, the Amazing Spider-Man game had the luxury of doing its own thing, despite being a movie tie-in. Yeah, Spidey's had it pretty good when it comes to video games in the last 15 years or so. Not all of them are good, but most of them are pretty great. Before we look at the Sam Raimi movie tie-in, let's take a peek at Spider-Man something 90s Web of Shadows, just Spider-Man. This was one of those truly groundbreaking sort of games for Spidey. It was the beginning of the gameplay style we'd later see developed for the first Spider-Man movie tie-in, and it certainly made its mark. You swing around, you climb on walls, you tie up bad guys, all that stuff. Of course, none of it is as quick or versatile as such things would be in later games like Spider-Man 2 and so on, but it was good for a first try. The levels tend to vary in length. Some levels amount to no more than a quick platforming section through a cave or across a few rooftops or even along the roof of a subway train, which hardly counts for anything, but I guess these could be seen as bridges between the much larger levels. Some take place indoors and are more fighting oriented, and some take place outside where you chase bad guys or the cops chase you across a city. The environments are constantly changing, so even though Spidey retains the same abilities all along, you end up using them in a lot of different ways that reflect the current scenario, and this can go a long way to mix things up almost constantly, so that you don't feel like you're doing the same old thing endlessly. That said, the outdoor levels do tend to drag on sometimes, despite being surprisingly small in scale. They aren't boring, and some of them are pretty long and satisfying, but a big chunk of them feel like obstacle courses that are over too quickly. I think the way webbing is implemented is pretty nifty. You use it to swing around, web at bad guys, make your own boxing gloves that do double damage, make a screen nuke shield of sorts, and even shoot gobs of it like a projectile. Of course, doing all of these things will make your supplies dry up pretty quickly, but you can pick up cartridges along your way. Interestingly, these don't just fill up the bar. You stockpile a supply of spare web cartridges, and the more you've collected by the end of the game, the more unused webbing you have to spare. But this webbing is ultimately limited, so use it wisely. You know how your weapons and ammo were limited in the older Resident Evil games? Yeah, it's kinda like that. Like I said, even swinging uses up this finite supply of webbing. But given how linear some of these levels are, it's clear that they didn't intend for you to swing around and explore the city, rather to just go forward and pick up cartridges along the way to replenish your webbing. In the other game we'll be reviewing today, webbing is still mostly limited and can be refilled with blue spider tokens, but I think it still refills automatically to a certain extent, though very slowly. Unfortunately, it never goes above that one bar, no matter how many blue spider tokens you collect. Needless to say, I like this system better than that system, if only because in this game you can easily wind up having loads of stockpiled webbing to unload in those hairy situations when you need it most. The story's pretty cool, mostly involving an invasion of symbiotes, but it's really hard to tell when or where this is supposed to take place. Supposedly it's based on the world of the animated series from the 90s, but I don't buy it. This game is better off having its own identity, like it's a tiny overlooked pocket in the multiverse of Spidey-Man schlock. I wouldn't say I have a nostalgia wiener for it or nothing, but there's still something really out there about it that makes it definitive of something, I don't know. Anyway, the music and voice acting are okay, not outstanding, but competent. The level designs are mostly good despite being so much smaller in scale than the next game we'll be looking at. There's tons of unlockables, cool alternate costumes, and while the gameplay is as clunky as it'll ever be in this style, along with the graphics, at least it's still colorful, it's still great for a first try. There was a sequel which was also good, but it really is just more of the same, and I don't find the story nearly as compelling. At least the graphics are a lot better in that game. It feels like they were trying to make a new series of games like this that would just go on, but it just didn't quite pan out. They're both good games, I just like this one a little bit more. Both games are decent and they deserve at the very least a rental, though the first is still worth buying. Alright, now let's jump into Spider-Man, the movie, the game, the movie, the game, the movie. The game controls pretty much like how the previous two Spider-Man games did, though the controls have been improved immensely. Don't get me wrong, it was a fun control scheme from the start, but a lot of things, most notably swinging, feel so much better and more liberating than before. It also helps that the cityscapes are a lot more open, giving you a better sense of freedom. I'm actually surprised that they managed to avoid making all the outdoor levels blend together in a mess of buildings that all feel the same, which was a problem in the Spider-Man game we just finished talking about. These levels do have invisible walls that you can't swing past, so it's like you're confined to a certain chunk of the city at a time, each one feeling like a playground. Still, the backgrounds do go a long way to make the game's world feel incomprehensibly huge nonetheless, even with these restrictions. Needless to say, we haven't quite reached the point of Spider-Man 2 yet. Still, it does kinda bug me that you can fall to your death, making the whole place one giant bottomless pit. It's still really easy to get around without falling, but at least the first 3D game had an excuse for this sort of thing. Oh look, the whole city's bathed in a fog and I can't go down there without getting lost. I guess I better stay on the rooftop so I don't lose my way and fall to my doom. In this, the city's as clear as day, and yet I think it can die even just by crawling straight down the side of a building until Spidey suddenly loses his grip and falls the rest of the way down. The developers of future Spider-Man games just need a little more time to innovate beyond that, I suppose. Needless to say, this is still stupid. One thing that does piss me off a bit is the fighting. Right near the beginning, there's this insane learning curve that'll catch you off guard for sure. It shouldn't be that hard, but unlike most typical hack and slash or beat 'em up games where you can damage multiple enemies at once and any enemy who gets caught in the range of your swipe will get hit whether you intended to hit them or not, this game forces you to focus on one enemy at a time.
So, it comes to this. Man to man, mano a mano, toe to toe, nose to nose, shirts and skins, eggs over meat.
I love that movie. Back to the game. This is troublesome when there are merciless thugs everywhere who don't wait for their turn. It's stupidly easy to wind up cornered while you get gangbanged and your health bar drains faster than Blackburster Critic chugs milk. Instead of just charging into battle all gung-ho and whatnot, you're encouraged to use your environment to your advantage, at least when you're indoors. From the rooftops, you can just push them off and be done with it. You can toss objects at baddies, some of which explode on contact. You can web up some of your foes and take the chance to concentrate on others who are still free. You can hide in the shadows. You can do all sorts of things, but none of them are really that helpful. You can also pick up golden spider thingies that give you new techniques, many of which make a return from the older Spidey games, including the classic screen nuke shield and the webbing gloves, along with a bunch of new hand-to-hand techniques. You won't find many of these near the beginning, of course, which is unfortunate considering these are some of the hardest fights in the game, I shit you not. The game remains satisfyingly challenging all the way through, but the sheer numbers of these dang thugs makes them such a chore to deal with. Let's compare them to the Shocker's thugs. Shocker's thugs toss bombs at you. They use deadlier firearms. They're stronger and take a few more hits, and are generally just more competent individually. And that's just it. Those fights are much more fair because you aren't being rushed by more than 2 or 3 at once most of the time. Compared to the second and third levels, the levels that follow are surprisingly forgiving. It's totally out of whack. Anyway, as you progress, you encounter new enemy types, some of which are so devastating, even one-on-one, that you just want to avoid them completely if you can help it. I still think it would be so much better if only they made it a little easier to ward off bad guys you're not ready to fight just yet by giving you a better reach so you can cock-block them. The best you can do is try to make them spread apart and pick them all off one by one while each one is isolated, but this really is just busy work. If you can make it past those first few levels though, you're basically in the clear. There are over 20 levels in all. We don't see as many villains appear as we did in the other games, but they have a bigger presence than before. Heck, the first 3 levels are dedicated to Uncle Ben's killer. 3! He's not even a supervillain. We'll get back to this campaign in a bit. Next is Shocker's campaign, which is more the same, though much less frustrating and has a much greater feeling of adventure. Next are Vulture and Scorpion, who each have fewer levels, with Scorpion only being around for a few rooms and a boss fight, and Kraven the Hunter gets his own level. In the Xbox port. Yeah, for some reason they cut this fantastic level out of every version of the game except for the Xbox version. What a waste. Sure, it's just one level, but it actually contributes a lot to the game as a whole, more so in the story than even the gameplay, and the gameplay's great. After these villains each have their own run, the next half of the game is devoted solely to the Green Goblin. Yes, after spending less time with each of the other villains, I was surprised the Goblin's campaign didn't end just as quickly. I found myself in level after level after level, eventually realizing that I was nowhere near the end of this game, and it's a lot bigger than I thought it was. I'm not complaining about this, of course. We get little nods to the Goblin sprinkled here and there throughout the first half of the game, so it's fitting that he'd completely steal the show sooner or later given his presence in the movie. Heck, just after you beat Uncle Ben's killer, the very next level, still very early in the game, plays the Goblin's theme music that you won't hear again until you meet the Goblin himself later on, after which point you'll be hearing it a lot more. It's just that sort of element that gives a villain a really good presence, I find. Anyway, once you finally beat the Goblin's campaign, the game ends. Also worth mentioning are some minigames and some obstacle courses that I think were supposed to be actual levels that were canned, but the developers feel like throwing them in there anyway just to be nice. This game also features my favorite tutorial of any video game ever. Sure, it's well designed and efficiently teaches you all the basics in little time, but who cares about that when you have this?
Of course, you'd know this if you played the basic tutorial, but I guess you're just cooler than the rest of us.
On top of all that, you can play as Mary Jane, wearing a dress. Don't ask. There's a really kick-ass unlockable we'll get to in just a bit. The music is pretty good, the voice acting is pretty good, the villains sound kinda cheesy but still pretty cool, and Peter himself sounds a lot more like Spidey should than in the movie that this is based on, cracking jokes much more often and really sounding like more of a wise-ass than he ever was in the Sam Raimi movies. The graphics are... well, I don't know what to say. In some ways it hasn't aged well at all, and in some ways it's aged great. This was the first Spidey game they tried to make more realistic looking, and they didn't do a terrible job. I mean, yeah, the faces are poorly animated and the expressions never changed, but at least they look okay when they're standing still. Anyway, as stiff as it is, I still like the way the game looks. I still remember hearing adults who saw me play this game gawk at how amazing it is that this could all fit on a little bitty disc. It's all about context. Like the other Spider-Man game we've just reviewed, I think this game has an identity of its own. Sure, it's a video game adaptation of a movie, and a lot of the material is based solely on that, but there's so much original content outside the context of the movies that's pulled off so much better here than it is in the case of most drawn-out superhero movie tie-in games that it has its own story to tell. In fact, there are a lot of things that outright conflict with the movies. When you chase down Uncle Ben's killer, he's leading a whole gang of crooks, and it's pretty clear that in this version, he did indeed kill Uncle Ben, and Flint Marko didn't. Granted, this was made long before Spider-Man 3, so of course they couldn't be expected to take a twist like that into account anyway. But my point is, there's a lot going on in this game that you never see any of in any other movies, and yet it isn't even an issue of whether I prefer the story elements of this game or the actual movie, or what should be considered non-canon and by definition not important or valuable enough to talk about. It's just fine as its own little something. Another Spider-Man universe similar to that of the movies, but still gestating in the process of blooming to become a wildly different beast altogether. There's something. Heck, even the dialogue feels different. Just listen to some of the things this much angrier Tobey Maguire says.
Fuse goes. Now I've got you.
I can't tell you, he'd kill me.
What makes you think I won't?
Oh.
Sounds like the police are closing in.
Oh, really?
Whatever's left after I'm done.
What a freak, man.
I'm sick of your ugly face.
You can even play as Harry Osborn wearing the Green Goblin costume. No, I don't mean the new pseudo-goblin from the third movie you could play as in the third game. Shit, goblin. I mean, he wears the same cheesy armor from the first movie, his old man's costume, he rides the same glider, uses the same attacks his father would in a boss fight, and flies around the whole level like he just don't care. So you see, he isn't even a reskin. He's also really overpowered. He even gets his own dialogue, and is voiced by Josh Keaton, the future spectacular Spider-Man.
Just need to get one more. Can't get caught now.
Man, small multiverse. There really isn't much injustice to be found here, aside from these games simply being forever hopelessly overshadowed by the later, admittedly greater games. These games are different, but not bad. All things considered, I think Spidey's early forays into the realm of 3D gaming were worth it, and despite their flaws, these games still hold up today. Anyway, Spider-Man the Game is a great movie that raises the bar set by earlier 3D Spider-Man titles. Still, this is the last we'd see with this gameplay style, and is probably the best we'll ever have to see of it. Next time we'll take a look at the game that changed the world forever.
I'm just trying to imagine, like, some senior citizen in, like, some retirement home talking to, like, his friends or whatever, saying, I'm gonna bust out of here one day, I'm gonna make wings and fly away. And then they're all like, oh, shut up, you nincompoop. And then one day he just kills everybody and does actually fly away. That would actually be very interesting. Someone should make a movie about that.